A king known for wisdom made a series of decisions that slowly dismantled everything he had built. This is a chronological reconstruction of how King Solomon rose to power, established one of the most stable and prosperous kingdoms in Israel's history, and then moved step by step into a pattern of choices that altered the direction of his reign. We will not move through this story as a summary or a collection of isolated moments. Instead, we will follow the sequence as it unfolds, from his selection as successor to the consolidation of his rule, the expansion of his influence, and the gradual development of conditions that led to decline. The primary sources for this reconstruction are the biblical accounts found in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. These texts provide the framework for understanding both the achievements and the later shifts in Solomon's leadership. Our focus will remain on what is recorded: actions, policies, alliances, and their consequences over time. This includes how Solomon structured governance, how he managed resources, how he engaged with surrounding nations, and how internal priorities began to change. This matters because the outcome of his reign cannot be explained by a single failure. It must be understood as the result of a sequence. At the beginning, the situation is defined by stability achieved through decisive action. Solomon inherits a kingdom that has already been unified under King David, but that unity is not automatically secure. Early decisions focus on consolidating authority and removing uncertainty. From there, the kingdom enters a period of expansion marked by economic growth, large-scale construction, and increased international presence. This phase represents the peak of his reign, where structure, influence, and resources align. However, the same period that establishes strength also introduces new variables. Political alliances expand, administrative demands increase, and long-term decisions begin to shape internal conditions in ways that are not immediately visible. This is where the trajectory begins to shift. The change is not sudden, and it is not always recognized at the moment it occurs. Instead, it develops through accumulation, one decision at a time, each one building on the previous. Few people examine one key detail. The decline does not begin with collapse. It begins while the system is still functioning at a high level. This matters because it makes the turning point difficult to identify in real time. The structures that support success can also carry the conditions that lead to instability if they are not adjusted. In Solomon's case, the same decision-making capacity that established his position also directs the sequence that follows. Another important element is the relationship between internal priorities and external outcomes. Policies that appear effective in the short term, such as alliances, construction projects, and resource management, produce long-term effects that are not immediately apparent. The narrative shows how these effects accumulate and begin to influence the direction of the kingdom. Understanding this connection is essential for tracing how the transition from stability to decline occurs. So the central question guiding this reconstruction is direct. At what point did the decisions that once strengthened the kingdom begin to produce different results? And how did those changes move from isolated developments to a sustained shift in direction? Before we begin, support the channel, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? And one more question based on what you already know. When do you think Solomon's trajectory first started to change? Now, we begin at the starting point. Asset 1. Accession and consolidation of power. After the death of King David, the transition of power does not occur without tension. The succession is contested, with competing claims that reflect underlying divisions within the royal structure. Solomon's position is secured through a combination of prior designation by David and decisive actions taken during the early phase of his reign. This matters because the stability of his rule at the beginning depends not only on inheritance, but on how effectively he neutralizes opposition. One of the first challenges comes from Adonijah, another son of David, who had previously attempted to position himself as successor. Although he initially appears to accept Solomon's rule, subsequent actions are interpreted as a continued threat. Solomon responds by ordering his execution. This decision is significant because it establishes a pattern early in his reign. Potential instability is addressed directly and without delay. The objective is clear: remove ambiguity around authority. Other figures associated with previous power structures are also addressed. Joab, who had been a central military leader under David, is executed after seeking refuge, and a priest who had supported Adonijah is removed from his position. These actions are not random. They are targeted measures aimed at consolidating control over military and religious influence. This matters because it shows that Solomon's early stability is actively constructed, not passively inherited. Once opposition is addressed, the focus shifts to establishing governance. Solomon begins to organize the kingdom's administrative structure, appointing officials and defining responsibilities. This includes the division of the kingdom into districts for purposes of resource management and supply. The system is designed to support the royal court and maintain consistent provision. This is a practical step that reflects an emphasis on efficiency and control. A defining moment in this early phase is the account of Solomon's request for wisdom. In a dream described in the biblical text, he asks not for wealth or power, but for the ability to govern effectively. This request is granted, and it becomes a central element of his identity. This matters because it frames his early reign as being guided by a specific priority: judgment and understanding in leadership. The narrative reinforces this through the well-known case involving two women disputing over a child. Solomon's response, proposing a solution that reveals the true mother, demonstrates the practical application of his decision-making ability. This event is not included as an isolated story, but as evidence of how his leadership functions in real situations. It establishes credibility and reinforces his reputation. By the end of this phase, Solomon has secured his position, removed key threats, and established the foundation of his administration. The kingdom is stable, and his leadership is recognized both internally and externally. The conditions are set for expansion and development. The next phase will follow how this stability translates into growth, including economic expansion, international relations, and the construction projects that define the peak of his reign. ACT 2. Expansion, alliances, and structural growth. With internal stability established after the consolidation phase, the reign of King Solomon moves into a period defined by expansion and development. The early decisions that secured his authority now create the conditions for broader initiatives. This matters because the kingdom is no longer focused on internal threats. It can now allocate resources toward growth, infrastructure, and external relations. One of the first indicators of this shift is the formation of strategic alliances with neighboring powers. Among these, the alliance with Egypt stands out. Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh, creating a political connection that stabilizes relations between Israel and a major regional power. This decision is significant because it reflects a change in approach. Instead of relying solely on military strength or internal control, Solomon uses diplomatic relationships to secure external stability. This reduces the likelihood of conflict and allows the kingdom to operate without immediate external pressure. At the same time, this alliance introduces a new dynamic. Political marriages are not only agreements between leaders, they also bring cultural and religious influence into the kingdom. While the immediate effect is stability, the long-term implications are not fully addressed at this stage. This matters because it establishes a pattern where decisions made for strategic advantage also carry secondary effects that may not be immediately visible. Another key development during this phase is the beginning of large-scale construction projects. The most prominent of these is the preparation for building the temple in Jerusalem. This project requires coordination of resources, labor, and external cooperation. Solomon forms a working relationship with Hiram, king of Tyre, who provides materials such as cedar wood and skilled labor. This partnership is essential because it allows access to resources that are not available locally. It also reflects the increasing integration of Israel into a network of regional trade and cooperation. The organization required for these projects leads to further administrative development. Labor forces are structured, supply chains are established, and oversight is assigned to ensure that work progresses efficiently. This level of organization is important because it demonstrates the capacity of Solomon's administration to manage complex operations. The kingdom is no longer operating on a small scale. It is coordinating activities that require sustained planning and execution. At the same time, the expansion of construction and administration increases demand on the population. Labor is drawn from various parts of the kingdom, and resources are redirected to support these projects. While the text does not immediately present this as a problem, it introduces a factor that will become relevant later. Growth requires input, and that input must come from within the system. This matters because the balance between development and burden is not yet tested in this phase. Another aspect of expansion is the development of trade networks. The alliance with Tyre extends beyond construction into economic activity. Trade routes are established, and the kingdom begins to engage more actively in regional exchange. This increases wealth and access to goods, contributing to the overall prosperity of the kingdom. The expansion of trade also reinforces diplomatic relationships, creating a network of mutual benefit. By the end of this phase, the kingdom has moved from internal consolidation to outward growth. Alliances are in place, construction projects are underway, and administrative systems are functioning at a higher level of complexity. The conditions for prosperity are being established, supported by decisions that prioritize stability and expansion. However, the introduction of alliances, increased demand on resources, and integration with external systems also create variables that will influence the direction of the kingdom over time. These factors are not yet producing visible tension, but they are becoming part of the structure. The next phase will follow how these developments reach their peak, including the completion of major projects, the accumulation of wealth, and the point at which expansion achieves its highest level of success. As the initial phase of expansion stabilizes through alliances and resource coordination, the reign of King Solomon moves into a period where large-scale projects are executed, and the economic capacity of the kingdom increases significantly. This stage is defined by completion rather than preparation. The systems introduced earlier, labor organization, external partnerships, and administrative oversight are applied at full scale. This matters because the effectiveness of these systems is no longer theoretical. It is measured by results. The construction of the temple in Jerusalem becomes the central project of this phase. The work proceeds over several years, requiring sustained coordination between local labor and external suppliers, particularly through the ongoing relationship with Hiram of Tyre. Materials are transported over distance, skilled workers are assigned to specialized tasks, and the project is managed in stages to ensure continuity. The temple is not only a religious structure, but also a demonstration of organizational capacity. Its completion represents a convergence of resources, planning, and execution at a level not previously recorded in the kingdom. In parallel with the temple, Solomon undertakes additional construction projects, including his own palace complex and other administrative buildings. These projects extend over a longer period and require continued allocation of labor and materials. This expansion of construction beyond a single focal point is significant, because it reflects a broader approach to development. The kingdom is not only building a central structure, it is reshaping its physical and administrative landscape. The economic dimension of this phase becomes increasingly visible through the accumulation of wealth. Trade networks established earlier are now fully active, bringing in goods such as gold, silver, and other valuable materials. The biblical text describes regular inflow of resources, indicating that the kingdom is operating within a system of ongoing exchange rather than isolated transactions. This matters because consistent inflow allows for sustained expenditure on projects and administration without immediate depletion of resources. Another important development is the organization of revenue and supply. The kingdom is divided into administrative districts responsible for providing resources to the royal court on a rotating basis. This system ensures a steady supply without overburdening a single region at any given time. From a structural perspective, this is an efficient solution to managing large-scale consumption. However, it also introduces a level of dependency on consistent output from each district, which becomes a factor in long-term sustainability. The increase in wealth also affects the visibility of the kingdom beyond its borders. External observers recognize the scale of Solomon's operations, leading to increased interaction with other leaders. This is illustrated in accounts such as the visit of the Queen of Sheba, who comes to observe and test the extent of Solomon's wisdom and the prosperity of his kingdom. This interaction is not isolated. It reflects a broader recognition of Israel as a significant regional presence. This matters because external perception reinforces internal stability and opens additional channels for exchange. At the same time, the expansion of wealth and construction introduces a growing demand on labor and resources. The systems in place are functioning effectively, but they require continuous input. Labor is organized in shifts, and resources are distributed across multiple projects. While the narrative presents this as successful, it also establishes a condition where the balance between output and demand must be maintained. This balance is not yet under strain, but it becomes part of the underlying structure. By the end of this phase, the kingdom has reached a point where its administrative systems, economic capacity, and construction efforts are fully operational. The temple stands as a central achievement, supported by a network of projects and resources that demonstrate the scale of Solomon's reign. Wealth is flowing, alliances are stable, and the kingdom is recognized externally. However, the very systems that enabled this level of success, centralized administration, continuous resource demand, and integration with external networks, are also increasing the complexity of maintaining stability. These factors do not yet disrupt the system, but they set the conditions for the next phase, when the peak of prosperity begins to reveal its underlying pressures. At these days, the reign of King Solomon reaches its highest level of visible success. The major construction projects are completed or fully operational. Trade networks are established and functioning, and the administrative system is producing consistent results. From an external perspective, the kingdom appears stable, wealthy, and well-organized. This matters because the conditions that define the peak are also the conditions under which early imbalances begin to form, even if they are not immediately recognized. The biblical accounts describe a period where wealth accumulates at a level that distinguishes Israel from surrounding regions. Gold and silver become abundant, and imported goods reflect extensive trade connections. The court operates with a level of provision that indicates surplus rather than scarcity. This is not presented as a temporary condition, but as an ongoing state supported by established systems. The significance of this lies in sustainability. A system operating at this level must maintain consistent input to support its output. At the same time, the scale of administration required to manage this prosperity increases. Officials are responsible for overseeing districts, managing resources, coordinating labor, and maintaining supply chains. The complexity of this structure is a direct result of earlier expansion. This matters because increased complexity requires increased control and coordination. The system must function without interruption, or the effects will propagate through multiple levels of operation. Another defining feature of this phase is the expansion of Solomon's personal household and court. The text describes a large number of attendants, officials, and associated personnel, all of whom depend on the administrative system for provision. This is not only a reflection of status, but also a structural factor. The larger the court, the greater the demand on resources. This demand is sustained through the same district-based system that supports the kingdom's operations, meaning that efficiency must remain high across all regions. At the same time, the pattern of political alliances continues to develop. Solomon forms multiple alliances through marriage, not limited to the earlier connection with Egypt. These relationships extend Israel's influence and maintain stability with neighboring powers. However, each alliance introduces additional variables. Cultural and religious influences begin to enter the kingdom through these connections. While the immediate effect is political stability, the long-term impact is more complex. This matters because external influence begins to interact with internal structures, The accumulation of wealth and expansion of alliances also affect the distribution of focus within the kingdom. Resources and attention are directed toward maintaining the system at its current scale. This includes sustaining trade relationships, managing construction, and supporting the administrative network. The emphasis on maintaining the peak creates a condition where adjustment becomes more difficult. Once a system is operating at maximum capacity, any change requires redistribution of resources or alteration of established patterns. Another important factor is the relationship between central authority and regional output. The district system ensures that resources flow toward the center on a regular basis. While this creates stability for the court, it also means that regions are continuously contributing to sustain the central structure. This matters because long-term balance depends on the capacity of those regions to maintain output without degradation. The narrative does not yet describe strain, but the condition is established. By the end of this phase, the kingdom stands at its peak. Wealth is abundant, administration is effective, and external relations are stable. From a surface perspective, there is no indication of immediate decline. However, the structure now contains elements that require continuous maintenance, high resource demand, complex administration, and increasing external influence. The key development in this part is not visible decline, but the formation of conditions that make future adjustment more difficult. The system is optimized for its current state, but that optimization reduces flexibility. The next phase will examine how these conditions begin to shift, including the first clear indicators that the direction of the kingdom is changing from sustained growth to gradual imbalance. Although the reign of King Solomon reaches a point of peak prosperity and external recognition, the narrative begins to introduce elements that indicate a gradual shift in direction. These elements do not immediately disrupt the system, but they alter its internal balance in ways that become more visible over time. This matters because the transition from growth to decline does not begin with collapse. It begins with small adjustments that accumulate within an otherwise functioning structure. One of the clearest indicators of this shift is the increasing number of political marriages. What began as a strategic alliance with Egypt expands into a broader pattern involving multiple nations. The biblical text specifies that Solomon forms relationships with women from various surrounding regions, including Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and others. Each of these alliances strengthens diplomatic ties in the short term, reducing the likelihood of conflict and expanding influence. However, these relationships also introduce religious and cultural practices that differ from those originally established within the kingdom. This matters because the influence of these practices does not remain external. It begins to enter the internal structure of the court. Another significant development is the continuation and expansion of construction projects beyond the temple and initial administrative buildings. The narrative describes ongoing building activity in multiple locations, including fortified cities and storage centers. While these projects reflect continued growth and investment, they also require sustained labor and resource allocation. The system that supports these projects must operate continuously at a high level of output. This increases the dependence on both administrative efficiency and regional contribution. At the same time, the demand placed on the population becomes more consistent and less flexible. The rotating district system ensures that resources are delivered regularly, but it also means that each region is expected to meet its obligations without interruption. As long as output remains stable, the system functions effectively. However, this arrangement reduces the margin for variation. Any disruption in production or distribution has the potential to affect the entire structure. This matters because the system is now operating with limited tolerance for imbalance. The expansion of wealth and court size also continues during this phase. The number of officials, attendants, and associated personnel grows, increasing the overall demand on resources. This is not presented as excessive within the narrative, but it contributes to the cumulative pressure on the system. The larger the central structure becomes, the more it depends on consistent input from the rest of the kingdom. Another factor introduced at this stage is the gradual shift in focus from governance to maintenance of the established system. Earlier phases emphasized decision-making that expanded and strengthened the kingdom. Now, A significant portion of activity is directed towards sustaining what has already been built. This shift is subtle, but important. When a system reaches a certain level of complexity, maintaining it can require as much effort as creating it. This matters because it reduces the capacity for adjustment and adaptation. The most critical development, however, involves the internal influence of external alliances. The text begins to indicate that Solomon's relationships lead to the introduction of practices that are not aligned with the original framework of the kingdom. This is not described as an immediate or total shift, but as a gradual change in behavior. The significance lies in the direction of this change. What had been external influence is now becoming internal practice. By the end of this phase, the kingdom remains stable in appearance. Wealth is present, administration is functioning, and external relations are secure. However, the internal balance has begun to change. Increased demand on resources, reduced flexibility, and the introduction of new influences create conditions that differ from those that supported earlier growth. The key development here is the transition from a system optimized for expansion to one that is beginning to carry the weight of its own complexity. The change is not yet visible as decline, but the direction is shifted. The next act will follow how these conditions begin to produce observable effects, including the decisions that move the kingdom from stability into a sustained pattern of imbalance. Act 3. Turning point. Decisions that alter direction. As the structural pressures introduced during the peak of King Solomon's reign begin to accumulate, the narrative moves into a phase where those pressures translate into observable changes in decisions. Up to this point, the system has remained functional, despite increasing complexity. Now, the focus shifts from the structure itself to the priorities guiding it. This matters because the direction of the kingdom is no longer determined only by external growth, but by internal choices that begin to redefine its foundation. One of the most significant developments in this phase is the continuation and expansion of political marriages. The biblical text emphasizes that Solomon takes many wives from surrounding nations, forming alliances that extend beyond the initial strategic relationship with Egypt. These alliances strengthen diplomatic ties and maintain external stability, but they also introduce sustained external influence into the core of the kingdom. This matters because these influences are no longer peripheral, they become part of the daily environment of the royal court. The impact of these relationships is described not only in political terms, but in terms of practice. The text indicates that the presence of these alliances leads to the introduction of religious customs associated with those nations. This is a critical shift. What had been external differences now begin to affect internal behavior. The change is gradual, not immediate, but it marks a departure from the framework that had defined earlier phases of the kingdom. At the same time, Solomon's focus continues to include large-scale projects and maintenance of the established system. The administrative structure remains active, trade continues, and the court operates at a high level of provision. However, the emphasis begins to shift towards sustaining existing systems rather than initiating new forms of expansion. This change in focus is subtle but important. When a system transitions from growth to maintenance, its ability to adapt decreases, especially when new variables are being introduced. Another factor in this phase is the increasing complexity of balancing internal and external demands. Alliances require ongoing engagement, trade networks must be maintained, and administrative systems must continue to function without interruption. These responsibilities compete for attention and resources. This matters because prioritization becomes critical. Decisions about where to allocate focus and resources begin to shape the long-term direction of the kingdom. The narrative also begins to indicate that the cumulative effect of these decisions is not neutral. The introduction of new practices and influences alters the internal consistency of the kingdom's structure. What had previously been a unified framework begins to incorporate elements that do not fully align with each other. This does not immediately produce visible instability, but it creates conditions where internal coherence is reduced. At the same time, the demands placed on the population continue to support the central system. Labor, resources, and administrative output remain directed toward maintaining the scale of the kingdom. The system is still functioning effectively, but it is operating under increasing load. This matters because the margin for error or adjustment is reduced. When a system operates near capacity, small changes can have larger effects. Another important aspect of this phase is the lack of immediate feedback, indicating that the direction is changing. From a surface perspective, the kingdom remains prosperous and stable. This absence of visible consequence allows the pattern to continue. Decisions that introduce long-term effects do not produce immediate correction, which means they accumulate over time. By the end of this part, the kingdom is no longer only managing external growth, it is navigating internal changes that affect its foundational structure. The priorities guiding decision-making have begun to shift, influenced by alliances, sustained demands, and the need to maintain an increasingly complex system. The key development here is the transition from structural pressure to directional change. The conditions established during the peak are now influencing the choices being made, and those choices are beginning to alter the trajectory of the kingdom. The next phase will examine how these internal shifts become more visible, including the point at which the effects of these decisions began to produce observable consequences in both governance and stability. As the internal shifts and priorities continue under the reign of King Solomon, the narrative begins to present the first observable consequences of those changes. Up to this point, the system has absorbed increasing complexity without visible disruption. Now, however, the effects begin to move from internal conditions to external outcomes. This matters because the transition from hidden imbalance to visible instability marks the point where the direction of the kingdom can no longer be considered neutral. One of the most significant developments is the increasing influence of foreign practices within the kingdom. The biblical text states that Solomon's alliances through marriage lead to the construction of places of worship associated with the deities of surrounding nations. These are not minor or isolated actions. They involve the allocation of resources and the use of land within the kingdom. This represents a structural change. Practices that were once external are now being supported internally at an official level. This matters because it alters the consistency of the system's original framework. At the same time, these developments do not immediately produce political collapse or economic failure. The administrative systems remain in place, trade continues, and the kingdom maintains its outward appearance of stability. This is important because it shows that visible decline does not begin with total disruption. Instead, the system continues to function while underlying changes affect its cohesion. This creates a condition where the direction has shifted, even though the surface indicators have not yet fully responded. Another emerging factor is the growing distance between central authority and the general population. The demands placed on the population to sustain the royal court, construction projects, and administrative structure remain constant. While these demands were manageable during earlier phases, the continued expansion and maintenance increase the cumulative burden. The narrative does not yet describe open resistance during Solomon's reign, but the conditions for future tension are being established. This matters because sustained pressure without adjustment can lead to delayed consequences. The presence of external influence within the central structure also affects decision-making. When multiple systems of practice and belief coexist without clear integration, it becomes more difficult to maintain consistent policy. This does not necessarily result in immediate conflict, but it reduces clarity in governance. Decisions must now account for a wider range of considerations, some of which do not align with the original framework of the kingdom. This matters because increased complexity in decision-making can slow response and reduce effectiveness. Another important element introduced during this phase is the response recorded in the biblical narrative regarding divine evaluation of Solomon's actions. The text indicates that his later decisions are viewed as a departure from the earlier alignment that characterized his reign. This evaluation is not presented as an immediate consequence, but as a declaration of future impact. It establishes that the effects of these decisions will extend beyond the current moment. This matters because it introduces a forward-looking dimension to the consequences, indicating that the outcome will unfold over time. At the same time, the administrative and economic systems continue to operate. The kingdom still benefits from established trade networks and accumulated wealth. This coexistence of prosperity and internal inconsistency is a defining feature of this phase. It shows that decline does not require the absence of success. Both can exist simultaneously, with one masking the development of the other. The key development in this part is the transition from internal shift to observable change. The decisions made earlier are now producing effects that can be identified within the structure of the kingdom. These effects do not yet disrupt the system entirely, but they indicate that the direction has changed. By the end of this phase, the kingdom is no longer in a state of balanced expansion. It is operating with visible inconsistencies that reflect deeper changes in priorities and structure. The next phase will follow how these inconsistencies develop into sustained patterns, including the point at which the accumulated effects begin to produce irreversible outcomes. As the observable effects of earlier decisions continue to accumulate, the reign of King Solomon enters a phase where those changes begin to stabilize into a consistent pattern. This matters because once a pattern becomes established, it is no longer defined by isolated actions but by repetition. At these stages, the direction of the kingdom is not shifting temporarily, it is being reinforced through ongoing behavior. One of the clearest indicators of this consolidation is the continued support of foreign practices within the kingdom. What began as accommodation through alliances now becomes a sustained element of the internal structure. The biblical account describes the establishment of high places and altars associated with the gods of surrounding nations. These are not temporary allowances. They represent permanent additions to the landscape. This matters because the system is no longer simply influenced by external factors, it is incorporating them as part of its operation. At the same time, there is no recorded effort to reverse or remove these developments during Solomon's later years. The absence of corrective action is significant. In earlier phases, decisions were actively made to secure stability and remove threats. Now, despite the presence of factors that alter the original framework, there is no corresponding effort to restore that framework. This lack of response allows the changes to become embedded. It is not only the introduction of new elements that defines this phase, but the absence of adjustment. Another important factor is the continued demand placed on the kingdom's resources and population. The systems supporting the royal court and ongoing projects remain in place, requiring consistent output from the administrative districts. While the structure continues to function, it does so under sustained pressure. This matters because a system under continuous demand with reduced internal cohesion becomes less capable of adapting to new conditions. The margin for correction continues to narrow. The narrative also introduces a critical development regarding future consequences. The biblical text records a declaration that the kingdom will not remain unified after Solomon's reign. This statement is not presented as an immediate event, but as a result that will unfold in the next generation. This is significant because it establishes a direct link between Solomon's decisions and outcomes that extend beyond his lifetime. The effects of the current phase are therefore not limited to present conditions. They are projected forward. At the same time, opposition begins to emerge in a more defined way. Figures such as Hadad, the Edomite, and Rezon of Damascus are introduced as adversaries. These individuals represent external resistance that had not been present during the earlier phase of stability. Their emergence is important because it shows that the external environment is beginning to respond to internal changes. Stability that once prevented opposition is no longer fully intact. Another key development is the introduction of Jeroboam, who is positioned as a future leader over part of the kingdom. The narrative describes his rise within the administrative structure and his later association with the division that will occur after Solomon's death. This matters because it connects internal structural change with future political fragmentation. The system that once operated as a unified entity is now producing elements that will lead to division. By the end of this phase, the direction of the kingdom is no longer ambiguous. The changes introduced earlier have become established patterns, and the possibility of reversal has diminished significantly. The system continues to function, but it is operating on a different foundation than before. The key development here is the transition from change to permanence. What began as a series of decisions has now formed a stable trajectory that will determine future outcomes. The next phase will examine how these established patterns lead directly to the final state of Solomon's reign and set the conditions for what follows. After his rule ends, Bitistashe, the reign of King Solomon, has moved from gradual internal shift to a condition where the direction of the kingdom is effectively fixed. The system continues to operate administration functions. Trade remains active, and the structure established during earlier phases is still in place. But the foundation supporting it has changed. This matters because a system can remain operational while its long-term trajectory has already been determined. One of the defining features of this phase is the coexistence of outward stability and internal divergence. The kingdom still presents the characteristics of prosperity, wealth, infrastructure, and established governance. However, the internal consistency that once aligned these elements is no longer intact. The integration of foreign practices, sustained without correction, has altered the original framework. This change does not immediately dismantle the system, but it affects how future outcomes will develop. At the same time, the administrative structure continues to demand consistent output from the population. The systems of taxation, labor organization, and resource distribution remain unchanged in form, even as the internal direction shifts. This is significant because it creates a gap between what the system requires and the conditions under which it operates. The burden remains constant, but the cohesion that supported it earlier has been reduced. This matters because systems under sustained demand with reduced internal alignment are more vulnerable to disruption over time. Another key element in this phase is the presence of identified future consequences. The narrative clearly states that the kingdom will be divided after Solomon's death, with a portion remaining under his lineage and the rest separating under a different leader. This is not presented as speculation, but as a determined outcome linked to the decisions made during his reign. The importance of this detail lies in its timing. The division does not occur immediately, which allows the current system to continue functioning, but the result is already established. The emergence of figures like Jeroboam reinforces this forward trajectory. His position within the administrative system and his later role in the division of the kingdom connect present structure with future outcome. This matters because it shows that the conditions for division are already embedded within the system. The transition from unity to fragmentation will not require a complete restructuring. It will follow paths that have already been formed. Externally, the presence of adversaries continues to indicate that the stability of earlier phases has weakened. While these adversaries do not overturn the kingdom during Solomon's lifetime, their existence marks a change in the external environment. The kingdom is no longer operating without resistance. This matters because external pressure, combined with internal divergence, increases the likelihood of disruption once the central authority is no longer present. Another important factor is the absence of corrective transition before the end of Solomon's reign. The narrative does not describe a return to earlier priorities or a restructuring of the system to address the accumulated changes. This lack of adjustment confirms that the trajectory remains unchanged through the final phase of his rule. The system continues on the path established by earlier decisions without deviation. By the end of this part, the reign of Solomon is defined by a completed transition. It began with consolidation and expansion, reached a peak of prosperity, and then shifted through a series of decisions that altered its internal structure. The system remains functional, but its future outcome is no longer in question. The trajectory is set, and the effects will extend beyond the current generation. The key development here is the locking of direction. The combination of sustained internal changes, external pressures, and declared future consequences creates a situation where the outcome is no longer dependent on new decisions. It will unfold based on what has already been established. The next act will follow how these conditions translate into actual consequences. After Solomon's reign, including the division of the kingdom and the immediate impact on the structure that had been built, Act 4: Division and Immediate Consequences. With the death of King Solomon, the system he maintained through centralized authority immediately faces a critical test. During his reign, Internal divergence and structural pressure had been contained within a functioning framework. Now, with the removal of that central authority, those underlying conditions begin to surface. This matters because the stability of the kingdom was not only dependent on its structure, but also on the individual maintaining it. The transition of power passes to Rehoboam, Solomon's son. At the moment of succession, the kingdom remains unified in form, but the internal balance has already shifted. The administrative systems, resource demands, and regional expectations established during Solomon's reign are still in place. However, the capacity to manage these elements effectively is no longer guaranteed. This creates a situation where the first decisions of the new ruler will have immediate structural impact. A key development occurs when representatives of the northern tribes approach Rehoboam with a request. They ask for a reduction in the burden that had been placed on them during Solomon's reign, specifically in terms of labor and resource demands. This request is significant because it reflects accumulated pressure that had not been resolved previously. During Solomon's rule, the system functioned despite these demands. Now, those demands become a central issue in the transition. Rehoboam's response is not immediate. He consults two groups: older advisors who had served under Solomon, and younger advisors who had grown up within the royal court. The advice he receives reflects two different approaches. The older advisors recommend reducing the burden and responding in a way that would secure loyalty. This approach is based on maintaining unity through adjustment. The younger advisors, however, recommend increasing the burden, asserting authority more strongly. This reflects a different priority control through demonstration of power. The decision Rehoboam makes is to follow the second approach. He responds to the request by stating that the burden will not be reduced, and in fact, will be increased. This moment is critical because it activates the conditions that had been developing during Solomon's reign. The system, already operating under strain, is now pushed further without adjustment. This matters because it removes the possibility of stabilizing the structure through compromise. The immediate consequence is a rejection of central authority by the northern tribes. They declare separation, effectively dividing the kingdom into two entities. Rehoboam retains control over Judah and Jerusalem, while the northern tribes form a separate kingdom under the leadership of Jeroboam. This division is not gradual. It occurs as a direct response to the decision made during the transition. This outcome is directly connected to the trajectory established during Solomon's reign. The internal pressures, external influences, and lack of adjustment created conditions where unity depended on careful management. When that management fails at a critical moment, the system does not hold. This matters because it shows how earlier decisions extend beyond the individual who made them. By the end of this phase, the unified kingdom no longer exists. The structure that had been built and maintained has divided into two separate systems, each with its own leadership and direction. The next phase will examine how this division develops, including how both kingdoms attempt to establish stability and how the effects of the original shift continue to influence their With the division now established, the former unified kingdom enters a phase where two distinct systems begin to operate independently. The southern kingdom under Rehoboam, centered in Jerusalem, and the northern kingdom under This matters because the structural unity that once allowed centralized control, resource distribution, and coordinated policy has been replaced by parallel systems that must now sustain themselves separately. Each kingdom inherits elements of the previous structure, but neither retains the full capacity that existed under King Solomon. In the southern kingdom, Rehoboam maintains control over Jerusalem and the temple, which remains a central point of religious and political identity. This provides a degree of continuity. The existing administrative framework, though reduced in scope, continues to function. However, the loss of the northern tribes means a reduction in population, resources, and territorial reach. This matters because the system must now operate with fewer inputs, while maintaining similar structural demands. The balance that existed before division no longer applies. In the northern kingdom, Jeroboam faces a different challenge. While he gains control over a larger portion of territory and population, he does not possess the central institutions that had reinforced unity in the past, particularly the temple in Jerusalem. This creates a structural problem. If the population continues to travel to Jerusalem for religious practices, their loyalty may remain tied to the southern kingdom. This matters because political stability requires alignment between leadership and population. Jeroboam responds to this challenge by establishing alternative centers of worship within his territory. He sets up locations in Bethel and Dan, providing accessible points for religious activity that do not require travel to Jerusalem. This decision is strategic. It addresses an immediate political concern by reinforcing internal cohesion within the northern kingdom. However, it also introduces a structural change that parallels earlier developments under Solomon, where adjustments made for practical reasons carry long-term implications. Both kingdoms now operate under conditions shaped by earlier decisions, but influenced by new constraints. In the south, continuity exists, but with reduced capacity. In the north, capacity exists, but without established central institutions. This divergence is important because it leads to different patterns of development. Stability in each kingdom will depend on how these structural differences are managed. At the same time, the external environment begins to respond to the division. A unified kingdom had presented a stronger presence in the region, supported by coordinated resources and centralized leadership. The division creates opportunities for external powers to interact with the two kingdoms separately. This changes the strategic landscape. Instead of one system managing external relations, there are now two, each with its own priorities and limitations. Another important factor is the persistence of the systems established during Solomon's reign. Administrative practices, expectations of resource contribution, and patterns of governance do not disappear with division. They are carried into both kingdoms, but without the same level of coordination. This matters because inherited systems may not function as effectively in a reduced or altered context. Adjustments are required, but those adjustments are not always immediate or sufficient. The internal pressures that had been building during Solomon's reign also do not reset with the division. They continue to exist within each kingdom, though in different forms. In the south, the challenge is maintaining stability with fewer resources. In the north, the challenge is establishing legitimacy and cohesion without the previous central framework. These pressures shaped the early development of both systems. By the end of this phase, the division has produced functioning but distinct kingdoms, each adapting to its own structural realities. The immediate consequence of the split is not collapse, but divergence. Each system begins to follow its own path, influenced by both inherited conditions and new decisions. The next phase will examine how these paths develop over time, including the emergence of new challenges within each kingdom and the ways in which the initial division continues to influence their stability and direction. As the two kingdoms begin operating independently, their initial conditions start to produce different patterns of stability and instability. The southern kingdom, centered in Jerusalem under Rehoboam, retains the temple in a narrower but more continuous institutional structure. The northern kingdom, under Jeroboam, holds broader territory and population, but lacks the original central institutions. This matters because the divergence is not only geographic, it is structural, and it shapes how each kingdom responds to internal and external pressures. In the northern kingdom, the alternative centers of worship at Bethel and Dan become part of a system designed to maintain cohesion. While effective in the short term for reinforcing internal alignment, this system requires ongoing support and integration into governance. Over time, leadership transitions in the north introduce variability in how these structures are managed. The narrative in the biblical texts presents a sequence of rulers with differing approaches, creating inconsistency in policy and stability. This matters because a system that depends on continuous reinforcement becomes vulnerable when leadership changes do not maintain the same priorities. In the southern kingdom, continuity provides a different kind of stability. The presence of the temple and established practices creates a consistent reference point for governance and identity. However, the reduced size of the kingdom limits its capacity. Resources are fewer, and the system must operate within tighter constraints. This leads to a different type of pressure maintaining existing structures without the scale that previously supported them. This matters because stability based on continuity can still be challenged by reduced input and external threats. External interactions also begin to change. Surrounding powers no longer engage with a single unified kingdom, but with two separate entities. This allows for more flexible strategies by those powers, including alliances with one kingdom against the other or shifting support based on advantage. The division reduces the overall strength that had been present under a centralized system. This matters because external pressure can now be applied unevenly, exploiting the differences between the two kingdoms. Another important development is the accumulation of internal challenges within each system. In the north, frequent changes in leadership create periods of instability where policy direction can shift rapidly. This affects long-term planning and weakens structural consistency. In the south, stability in leadership is more consistent, but this does not eliminate challenges. The need to manage limited resources while maintaining established institutions creates ongoing strain. Both systems, though different in structure, are operating under conditions that require continuous adjustment. The legacy of King Solomon's reign remains present in both kingdoms. Administrative practices, expectations of governance, and patterns of resource management continue to influence decisions. However, without the centralized authority that originally coordinated these elements, the systems now function with reduced integration. This matters because inherited structures do not automatically adapt to new conditions. Without adjustment, they can contribute to instability rather than prevent it. Over time, the divergence becomes more pronounced. The Northern Kingdom experiences cycles of instability linked to leadership transitions and external pressures. The Southern Kingdom maintains a more continuous structure, but faces limitations in scale and resources. Both trajectories reflect the consequences of the original division, shaped by the conditions that had been established during Solomon's later reign. By the end of this phase, the two kingdoms are no longer variations of a single system, but distinct entities with their own patterns of development. The initial division has led to sustained divergence, with each kingdom responding differently to the challenges it faces. The next phase will examine how these patterns lead to long-term outcomes, including the eventual weakening of both systems and the broader implications of a division that originated from earlier decisions. As the two kingdoms continue on their separate paths, the long-term effects of the division begin to take clearer shape. What initially appeared as a political split now reveals itself as a structural transformation that alters the trajectory of both systems over time. This matters because division is not only an event, it is a condition that continues to influence outcomes long after the initial moment. In the Northern Kingdom, the pattern of leadership instability becomes more pronounced. Successive rulers come to power through varying means, and the lack of a consistent succession model contributes to ongoing disruption. Each transition introduces the possibility of policy change, which affects both internal stability and external relationships. Over time, this variability weakens the ability of the system to maintain continuity. This matters because sustained instability reduces the capacity to respond effectively to external threats. In the Southern Kingdom, continuity in leadership provides a more stable framework, but it does not eliminate long-term challenges. The reduced scale of the kingdom limits its ability to project influence and sustain the same level of resource flow that existed under a unified system. While the presence of the temple maintains a central point of identity, the overall capacity of the system is constrained. This creates a different type of vulnerability, less visible in the short term, but significant over time. External powers increasingly interact with the two kingdoms as separate entities, applying pressure where advantage can be gained. The absence of a unified front makes coordinated resistance more difficult. Alliances that might have been formed under a single system are now negotiated independently, often with different outcomes. This matters because external pressure, when combined with internal divergence, accelerates long-term weakening. Another key development is the gradual erosion of the integrated administrative system that had supported the unified kingdom. While elements of that system continue in both regions, they no longer function as parts of a coordinated whole. Supply chains, governance structures, and strategic planning operate within narrower contexts. This fragmentation reduces efficiency and increases the likelihood of imbalance. Over time, this contributes to the weakening of both kingdoms. The legacy of decisions made during the later phase of King Solomon's reign remains visible throughout this process. The introduction of internal divergence, the accumulation of structural pressure, and the lack of corrective adjustment all contribute to the conditions that made division possible. These factors do not disappear after the split. They continue to influence how each kingdom develops. This matters because it demonstrates continuity between cause and long-term effect. As time progresses, both kingdoms face challenges that test their ability to sustain themselves. The Northern Kingdom experiences cycles of instability that reduce its cohesion, while the Southern Kingdom operates within a constrained framework that limits its resilience. These patterns do not emerge suddenly. They are the result of accumulated conditions that have been developing since the latter part of Solomon's reign. By the end of this phase, the division is no longer simply a historical moment. It has become an ongoing reality that shapes the direction of both kingdoms. The initial split has produced a series of outcomes that extend across generations, influencing political, economic, and social structures in ways that cannot be reversed by a single decision. The key development here is the transformation of division into a sustained condition. What began as a response to a specific decision during a transition of power has evolved into a defining feature of the region's structure. The next act will shift from these structural developments to a broader perspective, examining what this entire sequence reveals about decision-making, consequence, and how systems change over time when early conditions are not addressed. Act 5. Internal fragmentation and loss of cohesion. After the division of the kingdom into two distinct entities, the immediate political consequences are visible, but a deeper process begins to unfold within both systems. The gradual loss of a shared identity that had once unified them. This matters because political division does not only create separate governments, it disrupts the internal coherence that allows a system to function with consistency over time. Under the reign of King Solomon, despite the internal shifts that had already begun, there was still a centralized authority capable of maintaining a unified direction. After the split, that central reference point no longer exists. Each kingdom now defines its own structure, priorities, and practices. This creates divergence, not only in governance but in identity. What had once been a single system is now two systems evolving independently. In the Northern Kingdom, the decision to establish alternative centers of worship becomes a defining structural element. These locations are not temporary adjustments. They are integrated into the system as permanent substitutes for the original central institution in Jerusalem. This matters because identity is reinforced through repeated practice. Over time, the population aligns with these new structures, creating a distinct internal framework that differs from the Southern Kingdom. In the Southern Kingdom, continuity with the temple and earlier practices provides a more stable reference point. However, this continuity does not fully restore the original unity. The system now operates within a reduced scope, and its identity becomes more localized. This matters because identity that was once shared across a larger system is now confined to a smaller structure, limiting its influence. Another important factor is the divergence in leadership patterns. In the North, frequent transitions of power introduce variability in direction. Each new ruler brings different priorities, which affects consistency. In the South, leadership is more continuous, but this does not eliminate internal challenges. Stability in leadership does not automatically translate into stability in structure, especially when operating under reduced capacity. This separation also affects how each kingdom interacts with external systems. Without a unified approach, alliances and conflicts are managed independently. This leads to differences in external relationships. further reinforcing divergence. This matters because external interaction influences internal development. Each kingdom begins to evolve within its own network of relationships, moving further away from a shared framework. At the same time, the legacy of earlier decisions continues to shape both systems. The administrative structures, resource expectations, and patterns of governance established during Solomon's reign are still present, but they are no longer coordinated. This creates inefficiency and imbalance. Systems designed for unity are now operating in separation, which reduces their effectiveness. Another key development is the gradual normalization of this divided state. What initially appears as a reaction to a specific decision becomes an accepted condition over time. New generations grow up within these separate systems, without direct experience of the previous unity. This matters because the possibility of restoring the original structure decreases as the divided state becomes the standard. By the end of this phase, the division has moved beyond political separation into structural and identity fragmentation. Each kingdom is no longer a part of a single system, but a distinct entity with its own trajectory. The shared foundation has weakened, and divergence is becoming permanent. As the two kingdoms continue to develop independently, the initial fragmentation of identity begins to express itself through increasingly different practices and internal structures. What had started as a political division now extends into the daily functioning of each system. This matters because long-term stability depends not only on leadership but on consistent patterns of behavior across the population. When those patterns diverge, the systems move further apart in both function and identity. In the Northern Kingdom, the alternative centers of worship established under Jeroboam become fully integrated into the structure of society. Over time, these practices are no longer seen as temporary solutions, but as standard elements of governance and identity. The population aligns with what is accessible and reinforced through leadership. This matters because repeated practice defines what is considered normal. The longer these structures remain in place, the more they shape the internal coherence of the kingdom. In contrast, the Southern Kingdom continues to operate with the Temple in Jerusalem as its central reference point. This provides a degree of continuity with the earlier unified system. However, continuity alone does not prevent drift. The reduced scale of the kingdom and the pressures associated with maintaining existing systems introduce their own form of instability. This matters because maintaining a structure without the original level of resources requires adjustment, and that adjustment is not always consistent. Another key factor in this phase is the difference in how leadership affects internal direction. In the North, frequent changes in leadership result in variations in policy and practice. Each transition introduces the possibility of new priorities, which can alter how the system functions. This creates inconsistency over time. In the South, leadership remains more stable, but this does not eliminate internal challenges. Decisions made within a smaller system have amplified impact, as there is less capacity to absorb imbalance. External interaction continues to reinforce divergence. Each kingdom forms its own alliances and responds independently to regional pressures. This leads to different strategic outcomes, which further separate their development. This matters because external alignment influences internal structure. The networks each kingdom engages with shape its priorities, resources, and long-term direction. At the same time, inherited administrative systems continue to operate within both kingdoms, but without the coordination that previously made them effective. Resource distribution, governance structures, and expectations of contribution remain in place, yet they function within narrower and less integrated systems. This creates systems designed for a unified structure are now stretched across divided entities, reducing their overall effectiveness. Another important development is the gradual shift in how each kingdom perceives itself. The shared identity that once defined the unified kingdom becomes less central. In its place, localized identity strengthens. The Northern Kingdom defines itself through its own institutions and leadership patterns, while the Southern Kingdom emphasizes continuity with its central structures. This matters because identity influences decisions. As each kingdom reinforces its own framework, the possibility of realignment decreases. Over time, these differences begin to accumulate into structural drift. The systems are no longer just separate, they are evolving in ways that make them increasingly incompatible. Practices, leadership styles, and external relationships all contribute to this divergence. The longer this process continues, the more difficult it becomes to reverse. By the end of this phase, the division has deepened beyond its initial form. What began as a split in authority has become a divergence in practice, structure, and identity. Each kingdom now operates according to its own internal logic, shaped by both inherited systems and new developments. The next phase will examine how these diverging paths begin to produce measurable outcomes, including increasing instability in certain areas and the long-term effects of sustained structural drift. As the divergence between the two kingdoms continues to deepen, the effects of that separation begin to accumulate in ways that directly impact stability. What had previously been a process of structural drift now produces measurable strain within both systems. This matters because once strain reaches a certain level, it no longer remains contained within internal dynamics. It begins to affect outcomes in governance, security, and long-term sustainability. In the Northern Kingdom, the pattern of leadership instability becomes a central factor in system weakening. Frequent changes in leadership disrupt continuity, making it difficult to maintain consistent policy over time. Each transition introduces new priorities, and the lack of a stable succession structure prevents long-term planning from being sustained. This results in a system that reacts to immediate conditions rather than operating according to a defined direction. This matters because reactive systems are less capable of managing cumulative pressure. At the same time, the structures that were established to maintain cohesion, particularly the alternative centers of worship, continue to function but require ongoing reinforcement. Without consistent leadership alignment, these structures do not operate with the same level of effectiveness. Over time, this reduces their ability to unify the population, creating gaps between central authority and regional behavior. This matters because cohesion depends on both structure and consistency. When one weakens, the other cannot fully compensate. In the Southern Kingdom, the situation develops differently, but leads to similar pressure. The continuity of leadership provides a more stable framework, but the limitations in resources and scale create ongoing strain. The system must maintain established institutions, including the temple and administrative structures, with fewer inputs than before. This requires efficient management, but efficiency alone cannot fully offset reduced capacity. This matters because sustained operation under constrained conditions gradually weakens resilience. External pressures also begin to intensify during this phase. Surrounding powers take advantage of the division, engaging with each kingdom separately and applying pressure where opportunities arise. Military threats, political alliances, and economic competition become more complex to manage without a unified system. This matters because external challenges amplify internal weaknesses. Systems that might function under stable conditions become more vulnerable when external stress is added. Another important factor is the persistence of inherited expectations from the unified kingdom. Administrative demands, resource contributions, and governance patterns continue to reflect a system that no longer exists. Both kingdoms attempt to operate using frameworks designed for a larger, more integrated structure. This mismatch creates inefficiency. Resources are allocated according to expectations that are no longer aligned with actual capacity. This matters because systems that do not adjust to new conditions tend to degrade over time. The cumulative effect of these factors is a gradual weakening of both kingdoms, though expressed in different ways. In the north, instability is more visible through leadership changes and inconsistent policy. In the south, weakening is less immediate, but develops through sustained pressure and limited capacity. Both trajectories reflect the long-term consequences of fragmentation combined with unadjusted systems. Another key development in this phase is the reduced ability to recover from disruption. In earlier stages, the unified kingdom could absorb shocks through its scale and centralized coordination. Now, each kingdom must respond independently with fewer resources and less flexibility. This matters because resilience depends on both capacity and coordination. Without these, recovery becomes more difficult. By the end of this part, the weakening of both systems is no longer theoretical. It is observable in patterns of instability, reduced capacity, and increased vulnerability to external pressure. The fragmentation that began as a division of authority has now produced sustained structural strain. The next phase will examine how these conditions lead to long-term outcomes, including the eventual decline of both kingdoms and the broader implications of a system that was unable to maintain its original unity. The division between the two kingdoms has moved beyond structural difference into a condition that is fully entrenched. What began as a response to a single decision has now become a long-term reality sustained by accumulated patterns of behavior, leadership, and external interaction. This matters because once fragmentation reaches this level, it is no longer dependent on specific events to continue. It is maintained by the systems themselves. In the Northern Kingdom, the pattern of instability has become normalized. Leadership transitions, which initially disrupted continuity, are now expected elements of the system. Each new ruler operates within an environment where maintaining control is an ongoing challenge, and long-term planning is limited by uncertainty. This creates a cycle where instability reinforces itself. The absence of consistent direction prevents the establishment of lasting structures that could counteract this pattern. In the Southern Kingdom, stability in leadership provides continuity, but it does not reverse the effects of fragmentation. The system continues to operate within reduced capacity, and the demands placed on it remain high. Over time, the effort required to maintain existing institutions without the support of a larger unified structure contributes to gradual weakening. This matters because stability without sufficient capacity cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Another key development in this phase is the complete divergence of identity between the two kingdoms. What had once been a shared framework is no longer recognized in the same way. Each kingdom defines itself according to its own structures, practices, and leadership patterns. This divergence is reinforced through generations, making the original unity less relevant to the current state of each system. This matters because identity influences the possibility of reintegration. As identity diverges, the possibility diminishes. External interaction continues to amplify this separation. Each kingdom engages with surrounding powers independently, forming alliances and responding to threats based on its own priorities. This creates different strategic paths, which further reinforce divergence. The absence of coordinated external policy reduces the overall influence that the unified kingdom once held. This matters because fragmentation weakens not only internal cohesion but also external position. The inherited systems from the unified kingdom are now fully adapted, in some cases, misaligned to the new reality. Administrative structures, resource expectations, and governance patterns continue to function, but they do so within altered contexts. In some cases, these systems support stability. In others, they contribute to inefficiency. This mixed outcome reflects the challenge of adapting existing frameworks to new conditions without complete restructuring. Another important factor is the reduced capacity for recovery. With fragmentation entrenched, neither kingdom possesses the scale or coordination necessary to restore the original system. Any attempt at reunification would require alignment across structures that have evolved separately over time. This is no longer a practical possibility within the conditions described. This matters because it confirms the permanence of the division. By the end of this phase, fragmentation is no longer a transitional condition. It is the defining state of the system. The unity that once allowed for centralized growth and coordinated development has been replaced by parallel structures that operate independently and with different trajectories. The effects of earlier decisions have fully materialized, not as a single outcome, but as a sustained condition that shapes everything that follows. The key development here is the transition from fragmentation to permanence. The system has reached a point where its divided state is self-sustaining, and the original structure cannot be restored through incremental change. The next act will move beyond fragmentation to examine how these entrenched conditions lead to long-term outcomes, including the eventual decline of both kingdoms and the broader implications of a system that could not maintain its original alignment. ACT 6 long-term decline and systemic collapse. With fragmentation fully entrenched, both kingdoms begin to experience a long-term process of decline. This decline does not occur as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual erosion of stability across multiple areas: security, economy, and internal cohesion. This matters because systems rarely fail instantly. They weaken over time as accumulated pressures reduce their ability to sustain themselves. In the Northern Kingdom, the pattern of leadership instability continues to be a defining factor. Frequent changes in rulers prevent the development of long-term strategies. Each transition interrupts continuity, making it difficult to maintain consistent governance. Over time, this creates a system that operates without a stable direction, responding to immediate challenges rather than managing long-term conditions. This matters because the absence of continuity weakens the ability to anticipate and mitigate future risks. At the same time, internal cohesion in the Northern Kingdom becomes increasingly fragile. The structures that were established to maintain unity, including alternative centers of worship, continue to function but no longer provide the same level of integration. Without consistent reinforcement, these structures lose effectiveness. This results in a population that is less aligned with central authority, reducing the overall strength of the system. In the Southern Kingdom, the pattern is different, but leads to similar erosion. Leadership continuity provides a degree of stability, but the limitations in resources and scale remain constant. The system must maintain key institutions, including the temple and administrative framework, with fewer inputs than the unified kingdom once had. This creates ongoing strain. Over time, maintaining these structures without sufficient capacity leads to gradual weakening. This matters because sustained strain reduces resilience, making the system more vulnerable to disruption. External pressures also increase during this phase. Larger regional powers begin to assert influence over both kingdoms, taking advantage of their reduced capacity and lack of coordination. Military threats, political interventions, and economic pressures become more frequent and more difficult to manage. This matters because external forces often accelerate internal decline, especially when systems are already weakened. Another important development is the continued reliance on inherited systems that are no longer fully suited to current conditions. Administrative practices, resource expectations, and governance structures remain in place, but they are operating within environments that differ significantly from those for which they were designed. This mismatch reduces efficiency and increases vulnerability. Systems that are not adapted to changing conditions tend to degrade over time. The cumulative effect of these factors is a steady reduction in the overall stability of both kingdoms. This reduction is not always immediately visible in a single event, but it becomes clear when observed over time. Patterns of instability, reduced capacity, and increased external pressure all contribute to a system that is progressively less able to sustain itself. Another key aspect of this phase is the diminishing ability to recover from disruption. In earlier stages, the unified kingdom could absorb shocks due to its scale and centralized coordination. Now, each kingdom must respond independently with limited resources and reduced flexibility. This matters because recovery requires both capacity and coordination. Without these, disruptions have longer-lasting effects. By the end of this part, the decline of both kingdoms is no longer a potential outcome. It is an ongoing process. The systems continue to function, but their ability to maintain stability is steadily decreasing. The conditions established during earlier phases are now producing sustained effects that weaken the structure over time. The next phase will examine how this erosion leads to critical points of failure, including the events that mark the transition from gradual decline to decisive collapse in each kingdom. As the gradual erosion of both kingdoms continues, the systems reach a stage where accumulated weaknesses begin to produce critical failures. These failures are not isolated incidents. They are the result of sustained instability, reduced capacity, and increasing external pressure. This matters because long-term decline eventually reaches a point where systems can no longer compensate for their weaknesses, and collapse becomes unavoidable. In the Northern Kingdom, the pattern of instability culminates in a loss of structural integrity. Frequent leadership changes, inconsistent governance, and weakened internal cohesion reduce the system's ability to respond to external threats. When a major external power identified in the biblical narrative as Assyria moves to assert control, the kingdom is unable to mount a coordinated defense. This results in the fall of the Northern Kingdom and the displacement of its population. This event is significant because it marks the first complete collapse of one part of the previously unified system. The fall of the Northern Kingdom illustrates how accumulated internal weaknesses interact with external pressure. The system does not collapse solely because of the external force. It collapses because it lacks the internal capacity to resist that force. This matters because it reinforces the connection between earlier fragmentation and final outcome. The instability that developed over time directly affects the ability to respond at a critical moment. In the Southern Kingdom, the process unfolds more gradually, but the trajectory is similar. While leadership continuity and central institutions provide greater resilience, the system continues to operate under sustained pressure. External powers, including Babylon, begin to exert influence over the region. This influence takes the form of political control, economic demands, and eventual military intervention. The Southern Kingdom is able to resist for a longer period, but the underlying conditions established earlier continue to limit its capacity. Another important factor is the cumulative effect of external domination. Both kingdoms, at different times, become subject to larger powers. This reduces their autonomy and further weakens internal structures. Decision-making shifts from internal leadership to external control, altering the way the systems function. This matters because loss of autonomy accelerates decline by removing the ability to adapt independently. At the same time, the inherited systems from the unified kingdom are no longer capable of sustaining stability under these conditions. Administrative structures, resource management systems, and governance patterns were designed for a different context. Under external domination and reduced capacity, these systems become less effective. This mismatch contributes to the inability to recover from critical failures. Another key development is the irreversible nature of these events. The fall of the Northern Kingdom is not followed by restoration within the same structure. The displacement of its population and the loss of its institutions mark a permanent change. In the Southern Kingdom, each stage of external control reduces the likelihood of maintaining independence. This matters because it shows that certain outcomes, once reached, cannot be reversed through incremental change. By the end of this phase, one kingdom has already collapsed, and the other is operating under conditions that lead toward a similar outcome. The process that began with internal fragmentation and structural drift has now produced decisive results. The systems are no longer able to sustain themselves independently. The next phase will examine the final collapse of the Southern Kingdom and the complete transformation of the system, bringing the long-term sequence to its full conclusion. With the Northern Kingdom already fallen, the Southern Kingdom remains as the last continuation of the system, originally unified under King Solomon. However, the conditions that led to the earlier collapse have not been removed. They continue to operate, now concentrated within a single remaining structure. This matters because the absence of one system does not eliminate the underlying cause, intensifies their impact on what remains. The Southern Kingdom, centered in Jerusalem, still maintains key institutions, including the temple and a more consistent line of leadership. These factors provide a degree of resilience that delays collapse. However, resilience does not equate to immunity. The system continues to face sustained external pressure, particularly from Babylon, which has become a dominant regional power. This pressure is not applied all at once. It develops through stages of influence, control, and eventual confrontation. At first, the relationship with Babylon involves submission and tribute, The kingdom operates under external authority while maintaining internal administration. This arrangement allows the system to continue functioning, but with reduced autonomy. Over time, this condition creates tension between maintaining stability through compliance and attempting to regain independence. This matters because decisions made under external pressure often carry significant consequences. As leadership within the Southern Kingdom responds to these pressures, shifts in strategy occur. At certain points, attempts are made to resist external control, leading to direct conflict. These decisions are critical because they trigger responses from a power that has significantly greater capacity. The result is a series of confrontations that progressively weaken the kingdom's remaining structure. The culmination of this process is the Siege of Jerusalem. This event represents the final stage of decline, where the system's reduced capacity, combined with sustained external pressure, reaches a breaking point. The siege disrupts supply, weakens defense, and isolates the central structure. This matters because once the core of the system is compromised, the surrounding structures cannot compensate. The fall of Jerusalem follows, leading to the destruction of the temple and the dismantling of central institutions. This is not only a political or military defeat, it is a structural collapse. The institutions that had defined continuity and identity are removed. The population experiences displacement, and leadership is taken into captivity. This marks the end of the Southern Kingdom as an independent system. Another important aspect of this phase is the permanence of the outcome. Just as the fall of the Northern Kingdom resulted in a lasting change, the collapse of the Southern Kingdom produces a transformation that cannot be reversed within the same framework. The system that began as a unified kingdom under David and reached its peak under Solomon no longer exists in its original form. The connection between this final collapse and earlier developments is direct. The internal fragmentation, structural drift, and sustained pressure that began during Solomon's later reign have now fully materialized. The sequence has moved from initial decision to long-term consequence, with each stage contributing to the final outcome. By the end of this phase, the process of decline has reached completion. Both kingdoms have fallen, and the system has transitioned into a new state defined by external control and loss of original structure. The next phase will examine the broader implications of this outcome, including what the full sequence reveals about decision-making, structure, and long-term consequence. With the fall of both kingdoms, the northern under Assyrian domination and the southern under Babylonian control, the system that once existed as a unified and expanding kingdom has fully transitioned into a different state. This is no longer a phase of decline. It is the completed outcome of a long sequence. This matters because the process that began with internal shifts during the reign of King Solomon has now reached its full structural conclusion. At these states, the defining characteristics of the original system are no longer present. Centralized authority has been removed. Administrative structures have been dismantled or absorbed by external powers, and the population has been displaced or reorganized under new control. The institutions that once supported cohesion, particularly those located in Jerusalem, have been disrupted or destroyed. This represents a complete breakdown of the framework that had been built over earlier generations. Another important factor is the loss of autonomy. Both kingdoms, at different points in time, become subject to external governance. Decision-making is no longer internal. It is directed by dominant powers that operate according to their own priorities. This changes not only political structure, but also how resources, labor, and social organization are managed. This matters because the system is no longer self-determining. Its direction is now shaped by forces outside of its original framework. At the same time, the population adapts to this new reality. Displacement, relocation, and integration into foreign systems create new conditions for survival and continuity. While the original structure has collapsed, elements of identity and practice persist within these new environments. This introduces a distinction between structural collapse and cultural continuity. The system as a political entity no longer exists, but aspects of its identity continue in different forms. Another key development is the historical permanence of the outcome. The unified kingdom that once operated under a single authority is not restored within the same structural framework. Later developments may reflect continuity in identity or tradition, but the original system does not return in its previous form. This matters because it confirms the finality of the sequence. The process has moved from formation to expansion, from expansion to fragmentation, and from fragmentation to complete structural breakdown. The connection between this final state and the earlier phases remains consistent. The internal shifts in priorities, the accumulation of structural pressure, and the absence of corrective adjustment all contributed to conditions that made fragmentation possible. That fragmentation, once established, created systems that were less capable of resisting external forces. Over time, these conditions led directly to collapse. Another important aspect is the cumulative nature of the process. No single decision or event is responsible for the final outcome in isolation. Instead, the result emerges from a chain of interconnected developments. Each phase builds on the previous one, narrowing the range of possible outcomes. This matters because it demonstrates how long-term consequences are formed not through sudden change, but through sustained progression. By the end of this phase, the sequence has reached its structural conclusion. The system that began with unity, expanded to a peak of prosperity, and then shifted through internal change, has now completed its trajectory. The outcome is not a temporary disruption, but a permanent transformation. The next act will bring the entire sequence together, examining what this progression reveals about decision-making, structural integrity, and how systems change over time when early conditions are not addressed. Act 7. What the sequence established. When the full trajectory is examined, the sequence that began during the reign of King Solomon reveals a consistent pattern. Individual decisions, when sustained over time, produce systemic consequences that extend far beyond their original context. This matters because the outcome is not defined by a single moment, but by the accumulation of choices that shape the structure of a system. At the beginning, decisions are made within a stable and controlled environment. The kingdom is unified, resources are sufficient, and the administrative system is functioning effectively. Under these conditions, decisions related to alliances, construction, and governance produce positive results. Growth is achieved, and the system expands without immediate negative effects. This stage demonstrates how effective decision-making can strengthen a structure when conditions are aligned. However, as the system grows, the nature of decision-making begins to change. The same processes that support expansion alliances, resource allocation, and administrative complexity introduce new variables. These variables do not immediately disrupt the system, but they alter its internal balance. This matters because the effects of decisions are not always immediate. Some outcomes develop over time, becoming visible only after they have accumulated. A critical shift occurs when decisions begin to affect the foundational structure of the system rather than just its external operations. In the case of Solomon's reign, this includes the integration of external influences into the internal framework and the sustained demand placed on resources and population. These changes do not produce immediate collapse, but they redefine how the system operates. This is the point where direction begins to change. As these changes continue without adjustment, they become embedded within the system. What was once an isolated decision becomes a repeated pattern. This matters because patterns are more influential than individual actions. Once the pattern is established, it guides future decisions, often without conscious recognition of the original shift. The transition from individual decision to systemic consequence becomes clear during the division of the kingdom. The pressures that had been building under Solomon's reign are activated during the transition of power, leading to immediate fragmentation. This event demonstrates how earlier decisions can create conditions that determine the outcome of future events, even when those events occur under different leadership. Another important aspect of this phase is the amplification of consequences over time. The initial decisions made during a period of stability produce effects that extend into later stages of the system's development. Fragmentation leads to divergence. Divergence leads to weakening, and weakening leads to collapse. Each stage builds on the previous one, creating a chain of outcomes that cannot be understood in isolation. The sequence also highlights the role of timing. Decisions made early in the process have a greater impact because they shape the conditions under which later decisions are made. As the system progresses, the range of possible outcomes becomes more limited. This matters because it shows that early alignment is critical. Once a system moves beyond certain points, the ability to change direction decreases. By the end of this part, the connection between individual decisions and systemic outcomes is clear. The trajectory of the kingdom is not determined by a single failure, but by a sequence of choices that alter the structure over time. The system evolves according to those choices, producing results that extend beyond the original intent. The next phase will examine how these patterns define long-term outcomes, including the concept of irreversibility and the points at which change is no longer possible within the system. As the sequence progresses from expansion to fragmentation and eventually to collapse, one of the most important patterns that emerges is the concept of irreversibility. This does not occur at a single moment, but develops through stages where the system gradually loses its ability to adjust direction. This matters because the outcome is not only shaped by decisions themselves, but by the point at which those decisions can no longer be changed. During the early phases of King Solomon's reign, the system maintains a high level of flexibility. Decisions related to governance, alliances, and resource allocation can be adjusted because the structure is stable and aligned. The system has capacity both in resources and cohesion to absorb changes and correct course when necessary. This stage represents maximum adaptability. As expansion continues, that adaptability begins to decrease. The introduction of complex administrative systems, sustained demand on resources, and integration with external networks increases the cost of change. Adjustments now require coordination across multiple layers of the system. This matters because complexity reduces flexibility. The more interconnected a system becomes, the more difficult it is to alter without affecting other parts. A critical stage is reached when internal changes begin to affect foundational elements of the system. The integration of external influences into the internal structure and the sustained pressure on resources create conditions that are no longer easily reversible. At this point, adjusting direction would require not just modifying behavior, but restructuring the system itself. This is significantly more difficult and often not attempted. Another key factor is the absence of corrective action during this stage. The narrative does not describe a systematic effort to restore the original framework once these changes are established. This lack of response allows the new direction to become normalized. Over time, what was once a deviation becomes the standard operating condition. This matters because normalization reduces the likelihood of reversal. Systems tend to continue in established patterns, unless actively redirected. The transition of power after Solomon's reign marks a point where irreversibility becomes visible. The accumulated pressures that could have been adjusted earlier are activated during the leadership change. The decision made by Rehoboam does not create new conditions, it reveals and accelerates existing ones. This demonstrates that the system had already reached a point where its direction was largely fixed. From this point forward, each stage of the sequence reinforces the loss of adjustment capacity. Fragmentation leads to divergence, and divergence reduces coordination. Without coordination, implementing large-scale changes becomes increasingly difficult. Each kingdom operates independently, limiting the scope of any corrective action. This matters because systems require coordination to reverse structural issues. Without it, change is confined to smaller, less effective adjustments. As decline progresses, external pressures further reduce the ability to adapt. Interaction with larger powers introduces constraints that limit internal discipline. Once autonomy is reduced, the system can no longer adjust freely. This marks a later stage of irreversibility, where external control replaces internal flexibility. Another important aspect is the compounding effect of time. The longer a system operates under a certain set of conditions, the more those conditions become embedded. Practices, structures, and expectations align with the current state, making change increasingly disruptive. This matters because reversal would require not only structural change but also realignment of behavior across the entire system. By the end of this phase, irreversibility is no longer theoretical, it is fully established. The system has moved beyond the point where internal decisions can restore its original structure. The trajectory is no longer open. It is constrained by accumulated conditions that define the outcome. The next phase will examine how these irreversible patterns translate into long-term consequences, including how early decisions continue to influence outcomes even after the original system has collapsed. As the sequence reaches its later stages, one of the most important patterns that emerges is the persistence of consequences beyond the lifespan of the original system. The unified kingdom that once operated under King Solomon no longer exists, yet the effects of its internal shifts continued to shape outcomes over extended periods. This matters because it demonstrates that the impact of decisions is not limited to the immediate structure in which they occur. The division of the kingdom created two separate systems, each carrying elements of the original structure while developing independently. Even after the collapse of both kingdoms, the consequences of that division remain embedded in the historical trajectory that follows. Patterns of fragmentation, external domination, and reduced cohesion do not disappear with the fall of the system's day. Influence the conditions under which subsequent developments occur. One key aspect of these long-term consequences is the persistence of structural patterns, administrative expectations, approaches to governance, and methods of resource management established during earlier phases continue to influence later systems, even when those systems operate under different authority. This matters because structures, once established, tend to outlast the systems that created them. They are adapted rather than replaced, carrying forward elements of the original framework. Another important factor is the continuity of identity under changing conditions. While the political structure collapses, aspects of cultural and social identity persist among the population. These elements are maintained through practice, tradition, and collective memory. This distinction between structural collapse and identity continuity is critical. It shows that while systems can fail, the elements that define identity may continue to operate within new environments. The role of external powers also reflects the long-term impact of earlier fragmentation. Once the unified system is divided and weakened, it becomes more susceptible to control by larger entities. This pattern continues across time, where external domination shapes the development of the region. The initial loss of unity creates conditions that make sustained independence more difficult. This matters because it highlights how early structural changes influence long-term geopolitical outcomes. Another key development is the way in which the sequence defines future possibilities. Once the system has moved through stages of fragmentation and collapse, the range of outcomes available to subsequent systems is altered. New structures must operate within conditions shaped by what has already occurred. This means that earlier decisions continue to influence not only immediate results, but also the context in which future decisions are made. The cumulative nature of these consequences is significant. Each stage of the sequence contributes to a broader pattern that extends beyond individual events. The initial shift in priorities during Solomon's later reign leads to fragmentation. Fragmentation leads to divergence, and divergence contributes to long-term instability and external control. These outcomes are interconnected, forming a chain that persists across time. Another important element is the loss of the original baseline. The unified kingdom represented a specific configuration of resources, authority, and identity. Once that configuration is lost, it cannot be fully restored within the same context. Future developments may reflect aspects of that original structure, but they do so within different conditions. This matters because it emphasizes the permanence of certain changes. By the end of this phase, it is clear that the consequences of the sequence extend far beyond the original system. The effects of decisions made during a period of stability continue to influence outcomes long after that stability has disappeared. The system's collapse does not mark the end of its impact, it marks the transition to a new phase where its influence operates indirectly. The next phase will bring the sequence to its final conclusion, consolidating all stages into a clear understanding of how the trajectory developed and what it ultimately reveals about decision-making, structure, and long-term consequence. At this point, the entire sequence from unity to collapse can be understood as a complete structural pattern rather than a collection of events. What began under the reign of King Solomon as a stable and expanding system has moved through identifiable stages that consistently build on one another. This matters because the outcome is not accidental. It follows a progression that can be traced step by step. The pattern begins with alignment. Early in the sequence, decision-making, structure, and purpose operate in coordination. The system is unified. Resources are sufficient, and leadership is effective. Under these conditions, expansion is possible and sustainable. Growth occurs without immediate negative effects because the foundational elements are working together. The next stage introduces complexity. Expansion requires increased administration, broader alliances, and sustained resource input. These developments are necessary for growth, but they also change the internal dynamics of the system. Complexity increases dependence on coordination and reduces flexibility. This matters because the system becomes more difficult to adjust as it grows. Following complexity, the pattern shifts into internal divergence. Decisions begin to affect foundational elements rather than only external operations. External influences become internal, and sustained pressures alter the balance of the system. At this stage, the system still functions, but its direction begins to change. This is the point where early conditions are no longer fully aligned. As divergence continues without correction, it becomes embedded. The system transitions from isolated changes to consistent patterns that define its operation. Once this occurs, the possibility of reversal decreases significantly. This matters because patterns are self-reinforcing. They guide future decisions and make alternative paths less likely. The next stage is fragmentation. The accumulated pressures and embedded patterns reach a point where the system can no longer maintain unity. The division of the kingdom represents this stage, where the structure splits into separate entities. This is not a sudden failure, but the activation of conditions that have been developing over time. After fragmentation comes divergence of paths. Each part of the system evolves independently, influenced by its own conditions and decisions. Without coordination, differences increase, and the systems become less capable of supporting each other. This matters because separation reduces overall strength and resilience. The final stages are weakening and collapse. Sustained divergence, reduced capacity, and external pressure lead to the eventual breakdown of both systems. The collapse is not caused by a single event, but by the cumulative effect of earlier stages. Each phase contributes to the final outcome, creating a continuous chain of cause and effect. Another critical aspect of this pattern is timing. Early decisions have the greatest impact because they shape the conditions for everything that follows. As the system progresses, the range of possible outcomes narrows. By the time fragmentation occurs, the trajectory is largely fixed. This matters because it shows that the most significant changes happen before they are visible. The sequence also demonstrates the difference between function and direction. A system can continue to function while its direction has already changed. During Solomon's later reign, the kingdom remains prosperous and stable in appearance, yet the internal conditions are shifting. This distinction is important because it explains how decline can begin during periods of success. By the end of this phase, the pattern is fully defined. The system has moved through alignment, complexity, divergence, fragmentation, and collapse. Each stage is connected, and the outcome is the result of the entire sequence rather than any single point within it. Now, we close the entire narrative. A CT8 final outcome and what it reveals. When the full trajectory is viewed without interruption, the reign of King Solomon can be understood as a continuous chain of decisions, conditions, and outcomes. The sequence does not rely on isolated moments. It progresses step by step, with each phase creating the conditions for the next. This matters because the final outcome is not defined by a single failure, but by accumulated change. The starting point is stability. After the death of King David, Solomon establishes control, removes opposition, and organizes governance. The system is unified, resources are sufficient, and leadership is aligned. Under these conditions, decisions produce growth. Expansion follows through alliances, construction, and economic development. The kingdom reaches a peak where structure, influence, and resources operate together effectively. As expansion continues, complexity increases. Administrative systems become more intricate. Resource demand rises, and external relationships introduce new variables. At this stage, the system still functions at a high level, but its flexibility begins to decrease. Adjustments require more coordination, and the cost of change increases. This is the point where internal balance becomes more difficult to maintain. The turning point occurs when decisions begin to affect the foundation of the system. External influences move into the internal structure, and sustained pressures alter priorities. These changes do not immediately disrupt the system, but they redefine how it operates. The kingdom remains prosperous, but its direction has shifted. This distinction is critical. Function continues, but alignment is reduced. As these changes persist without correction, they become embedded patterns. The system no longer operates according to its original framework. At this stage, the possibility of reversal diminishes. The structure continues to function, but it is now operating under different conditions. This matters because, once patterns are established, they guide future decisions and limit alternative outcomes. The transition of power activates these conditions. The request for reduced burden reveals accumulated pressure, and the response given by Rehoboam triggers immediate division. The kingdom splits into two systems, each inheriting elements of the original structure, but lacking full integration. This fragmentation marks the point where the system can no longer operate as a unified entity. Following division, divergence accelerates. Each kingdom develops independently, shaped by its own leadership, resources, and external relationships. Without coordination, differences increase, and overall resilience decreases. Over time, both systems weaken under sustained internal and external pressure. The final stage is collapse. The northern kingdom falls under Assyrian domination, and the southern kingdom later falls under Babylonian control. Central institutions are dismantled, autonomy is lost, and the unified system ceases to exist. This outcome is not sudden, it is the result of the entire sequence that preceded it. By the end of this reconstruction, the trajectory is clear. Stability leads to expansion, expansion to complexity, complexity to internal shift to fragmentation, and fragmentation to collapse. Each stage is connected, forming a continuous progression. When the entire sequence is analyzed from beginning to end, the defining element is not a single mistake, but the progression of decisions that gradually altered the structure of the system. The reign of King Solomon demonstrates how a system can move from alignment to collapse without a sudden break. This matters because the outcome is shaped long before it becomes visible. One of the most critical insights from this sequence is the concept of irreversibility. In the early stages, the system has full capacity to adjust. Decisions can be modified, priorities can be realigned, and the structure can absorb change without losing stability. However, as complexity increases and internal divergence begins, the cost of adjustment rises. At a certain point, reversing direction requires more than decision. It requires restructuring the entire system. When that restructuring does not occur, the trajectory continues forward. The turning point is not the moment of collapse or even the moment of division. It occurs earlier, during the phase when internal changes begin to affect the foundation of the system. This is a stage where alignment is lost. Even though the system continues to function, the kingdom remains prosperous, administration remains effective, and external relations remain stable. Yet the direction has already changed. This distinction between function and direction is central to understanding the sequence. Another key element is the role of accumulation. No single decision produces the final outcome. Instead, each decision contributes to a pattern. Early choices introduce variables, repeated actions reinforce those variables, and over time they become embedded within the structure. Once embedded, they define how the system operates. This matters because patterns, not isolated actions, determine long-term results. The sequence also shows how consequences extend beyond the original context. The decisions made during Solomon's later reign do not only affect his rule, they shape the conditions under which the kingdom divides, the way each resulting system develops, and ultimately how both systems collapse. The impact continues beyond the lifespan of the original structure, influencing outcomes across generations. Another important aspect is the relationship between internal condition and external outcome. The collapse of the kingdoms is not caused solely by external powers such as Assyria or Babylon. These external forces act upon systems that have already been weakened internally. This matters because it clarifies that external pressure exposes existing weakness rather than creating it. The final outcome is therefore the result of a complete sequence. Alignment that enables growth, complexity that reduces flexibility, internal divergence that alters direction, fragmentation that breaks unity, and sustained pressure that leads to collapse. Each stage is necessary to understand the next. Removing any part of the sequence would make the outcome incomplete. By the end of this progression, the original system no longer exists. The unified kingdom that began with stability and reached a peak of prosperity has transitioned into a state defined by division, weakening, and eventual collapse. This transformation is not temporary, it represents a permanent structural change. The key conclusion is clear. Systems do not fail at the moment they collapse. They fail at the moment their direction changes without correction. If you made it this far, like the video and subscribe for more deep biblical reconstructions. Now tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it there? And more importantly, at what exact moment do you think Solomon's outcome became irreversible?